The presentation you're about to see is a dramatization of scenes from the book Poems in the Case by Michael Bartholomew-Biggs. This book is a hybrid of mystery, murder, and poetry collection and is set in a week-long workshop retreat at a fictional writer's centre in Kent called Wheeled Barn, a location that gives the characters ample scope for reciting their poems to one another, but also provides something of a hothouse atmosphere in which tensions and rivalries can build up between people of an artistic temperament. We are about to eavesdrop on an evening poetry reading where the arrival of a guest poet acts as a catalyst to bring some fears and resentments to the surface. The reading and some of the key participants will be introduced by Julia Nelson, the Chief Administrator at Wheeled Barn.
Good evening from Wheeled Barn Writers Retreat. I'm Julia Nelson, the administrator here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our midweek poetry reading. We have two guest poets tonight. First, Seth Butler will be reading some of his political poems, and then, very excitingly, poet and publisher Stephanie Prince will give the very first reading of some recently discovered and unpublished poems by the late and much missed Eric Jessup. I'll say more about both of those in the second half, but we'll begin as usual with poems from the tutors and students on this week's residential workshop. I'll introduce the two tutors, Stephanie Prince and George Hamlin, and then leave them to run the rest of the first half. Stephanie Prince is proprietor at Epidermis Press. She's had the wonderful stroke of fortune to discover a treasure trove of lost poems by Eric Jessup, and she'll be reading from them tonight. The poems will, of course, be published by Epidermis later this year. But Stephanie is also a fine poet in her own right, particularly admired for her dark narrative poems. George Hamlin is justly famous for his beautifully crafted poetry of reminiscence and personal experience. It's particularly fitting that George is here for tonight's unveiling of the unseen Eric Jessup poems, because I'm sure we all know George was one of Eric Jessup's first poetic mentors, and the two men remained very close friends until Eric's untimely death. Now I'm going to hand over to George.
Good evening, everyone. Stephanie and I are just going to read a couple of poems to start things off, and I'm going to jump in first. Our residential course this week is about exploiting darkness and danger in poetry, and this little piece deals with the threats that can creep into seemingly normal situations, and I do literally mean creep. It's called Extra Passenger. The way you don't, I didn't look at him, the pre-existing occupant of the only partly empty seat remaining on the bus. You're brave, he said, which made no sense, until I saw the plastic box with thoughtful air holes on his lap. So what's in there? I asked, my voice maybe a quarter tone too high, as I pretended to be keen on peering through the box's scratched, translucent sides. Supposing he'd supposed I'd shudder if I saw a scorpion's black scuttle, or striped coils of snake, an Orwell sewer rat, or worse, a mouse-sized tufted thing suspended under far too many jointed legs. He smiled. It isn't in the box, he said, holding out his hand towards me. Well, I suppose I should call that a found poem, or maybe even a pilfered one, since the incident, a true incident, actually happened to a friend of mine. Okay, it's over to you now, Stephanie.
Oh, thank you, George, for that little attempt to unsettle us. I have to say, I always steer clear of found poetry. Always seems a bit too close to journalism. Oh, sorry, George. That sounds a bit rude, doesn't it? I mean, of course, that found poems are tricky unless they're really well done. Anyway, here's a little something of mine that's also meant to generate an air of alarm at how easily others can manipulate us. It's called Arrangement for Strings, and I think George will particularly appreciate it. Jazz and puppetry, she says, are twins. She's right. Harmonic lines allow as little freedom as a finger up the spine. I'm a homemade marionette and she holds the strings. Won't you come in here, she calls, pretending I am free to choose. Both puppetry and jazz mean risks. She'll brush me with a kiss or else a lash. I won't ask which until I close the door. Puppetry works hand in glove with jazz. My first choice orchestra has been marched away in chains and handcuffs. In its place, a second string quintet rehearses ersatz, hut club music.
I know this isn't a workshop session, Stephanie, but I think I must just say a quick word about that poem. Such a classic example of your stock in trade, setting up a menacing atmosphere, hinting at dark secrets. And all the while, what you're really doing is making the reader collude with you in a frothy fantasy. We admire your rhetorical skill even when we know it's simply there to cover up a lack of substance. Very clever. Anyway, that's enough from us. Let's hear something now from the students working with us here at Wheel Barn this week. First up, I'm calling on Stanley Spencer, who assures me he's nothing to do with the famous artist. However, Stanley is something quite unusual in the world of poetry. He's a mathematician doing inscrutable things with codes and cryptology. I don't know how that affects his poetry, whether he's more likely than the rest of us to be seduced by the lure of pattern and regularity, relentless pentameters and so on. I do know, though, that I would have expected an expert in coding to be able to get his laptop to run Zoom. However, there is evidently some deep security problem and Stanley is having to share someone else's screen. Are you there, Stanley?
Yes, I am there. And it can be a bit tiresome, you know, when people, even some in this group, persist in misunderstanding the nature of mathematics and how it underpins my work. So I want to make it as clear as I can that my poem that I'm going to read is a set of iambic permutations and combinations on a closed finite set. And that set are the words from a 1930s song by Gerald Marks and Seymour Simons that you'll know perfectly well. I want you to notice the harmonic resonances between the words as I have rearranged them. And please don't be distracted by any superficial meaning that they seem to acquire in the process. The poem is called All of Me. Once I was all heart. That left no part I'll never lose to you. Was I to go? My left arm's all that I can part with? No. So use me how you want to. Take the part I'll never lose without you. Part your wanton lips and cry, go on, that was so good. Eyes see, eyes want, arms take, arms use. Lips go, goodbye, dear. That was you with me. That was how to lose me. You never took my wants to heart. You never took me to see Can-Can, not the good part. All you left me with was a can with all the outtakes. Well, I think perhaps I'll surprise you with my second poem because I'm going to be offering a counterexample to the common assertion that mathematicians are only interested in mathematics. It's something dark I've been working on with the tutors this week, or mostly by myself, actually. And it's called Grand Mal, which you will know is an alias for epilepsy, which is a condition I have a personal interest in because, of course, I have been engaged in a lot of mathematical analysis of electrical brainwaves. Yes, Grand Mal. Misprints make him restless still by being not quite wrong. Is this another tiny crease preceding total folding of the world, as images from either side fail to match but dip and slide. The first time that a book dissolved before his eyes was in a French class, but all languages had left him, soundless, dropping like a dead thing, waking later with no answer for the problem he'd become. One consultant said he shared pathology with Caesar, and perhaps as well with Dostoevsky, which scarcely seemed a consolation for permanent uncertainty. Sunlight glancing off the ocean imitates the filament within the naked bulb that hangs beside a door that opens inwards and whose flashing is the final warning. A handle is about to turn.
Thank you, Stanley. Now, I'm pretty sure that our next reader is going to be rather familiar. You're bound to have seen Mary Maxwell in an episode of Poirot or Morse. She's one of those TV actors who keeps cropping up on our screens. And now she turns out to have a talent for poetry too. It developed, she tells me, as a way of whiling away time when she's working in theatre, but doesn't come on till Act 3. Well, you're on now. Cue Mary Maxwell.
As you might expect, with my theatre background, I like a poem that tells a story, but you'll have to keep alert and stay with the plot of this one. It's a character piece, so I hope no one minds me attempting a Yorkshire accent. The poem is all about couples, and its title on the page is that curly symbol, and. Every Friday, Walt and Iris came to Bert and Flo's, played cards and had a beer or two, except when Flo said, "Sherry for the ladies?" They'd chat about the way their week had gone, settled in on Bert and Flo's plush three-piece suite. Then Iris died and went up to Creme with Walt and Bert and Flo and other friends in big black cars. So Walt came by himself on Fridays and they took to playing crib instead of solo. When Walt bumped into Betty at Co-op once or twice, they started going out to quiet pubs where no one knew them till they showed their faces in Walt's local. The thing was, Walt had been with Elsie once, years ago when they were young, and she died too. And that's when Iris came along to sort Walt out. He'd been a mess, and Iris was the saving of him. That was why most folk were always fine with Walt and Iris, but Walt and Betty, after all that Iris did for him, that wasn't right. It was too soon, and anyway, it wouldn't work. When Walt and Betty called on Bert and Flo one Friday, Flo made sandwiches and cups of tea. They talked about the weather and the underpass. And when they left, Bert whispered as he shook Walt's hand, "I shouldn't bother bringing her again." That doesn't reflect too well on the ins and outs of human relationships, does it? And neither does this next one. It's a sad truth that the best dramas seem to be driven by conflict and stubbornness. The title's Medical History. At 17, she lost her balance, fell in what she said was love with a boy who limped. The doctors said it would get worse. Her parents, doing what was best for her, did their best to hobble the relationship, whispering they would not want her handicapped by being married to a weakling. What they didn't reckon on or seem to mind was that she might be equally disabled by an able-bodied older man. when he decided he'd take care of all her cares until they vanished. So in 20 years did she. Since he had his stroke, she visits when someone gives her a lift. She never learnt to drive, hates buses, and the home is farther than she cares to walk.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for those fine performance pieces. Next, it's the turn of our overseas participant. Abigail Forsberry is from Canada, but she's over here doing a creative writing PhD. I think I can say from our one-to-one sessions that she's a woman who knows her own mind. I believe she and Stephanie have had some full and frank discussions as well. Abigail, what have you got for us this evening?
Okay, it's true. I'm a pretty serious person. Our respected tutors have found, however, that I bite back when the integrity of my vision is challenged. And I'm going to reassert my integrity by reading a poem that's come in for some harsh remarks this week. It's part of a sequence about the mental breakdown and suicide of my father last year. You really need to see it on the page because the zigzag layout is meant to mirror my dad's agonized mental struggles. It's called Labyrinth. He came up from the south, a tad off course already, but nothing you need to fuss about, he told himself. You're close enough. It took an actual obstacle, but was it really there? Or something he'd made up to make him stop and look for ways forward? He reckoned he'd found a way back by a back way to the center when his near tangential track turned inward twice. He'd barely ever been so close and never for so long. But even that was not the end of it. He stumbled out again to trudge a weary half circumference. He couldn't see his lowest points as opportunities for rising to occasions. And now I'm going to surprise you, change tack and change mood. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bad situation is to laugh at it. And the bad situation I'm dealing with next is the existence of a certain kind of music. I want you to imagine I'm a guy wearing a lumberjack shirt and blue jeans. Rhyme, regret, and irrational optimism in Canadian country and Western lyrics. Dust is rising up beside the highway where a John Deere tractor grumbles by. But since your dear John Letter headed my way, dust is not the thing that stings my eye and blurs Alberta highway to a cryway through a windshield streaked and smeared with tears. The road I'm riding now is a goodbye way that runs away from all our happy years. This would have been a straight and clear dry way if only I'd been driving back to you. But I've detoured onto a groan and sigh way. One bad mistake means you and I are through. Red roofs of Red Deer are coming nearer, and after that it's Edmonton ahead. I'm pushing on up towards Athabasca, where I was born and might as well be dead. This used to be my gravy and meat pie way. White propane tanks bunched in fields like sheep would soothe me in a kind of lullaby way when I came home to eat with you and sleep. You're angry in a like to see me fry way. You're telling me that my behavior stinks in a told another girl I'd be her guy way because I'd had a few too many drinks. As I'm getting near Leduc, I nearly puke. I'm gagging, dragging ragged hopes up north. I'm like a runner dreaming of a medal, but missing out on bronze and coming forth. Last week, this was my "I'll be warm and dry" way, with you at home to keep me safe and calm. Now it's the "I'll be living in a sty" way that takes me back to Daddy's sad old farm.
Well, I think you surprised us all there, Abigail, in more ways than one. And now, cliche alert, the last but by no means least of our readers this half is Barry Wigfall. He's taken his recent creative writing PhD and gone to work for one of those big publishers in whose shade Epidermis Press has to struggle to make a living. A little bird tells me that Barry and Abigail have actually got some kind of shared performance to round things off.
Well, wasn't that marvellous? I don't know how I'd have followed Abigail's tour de force if she hadn't agreed to help me with presenting this next poem. In fact, I wrote it quite a while ago, and until I met Abigail this week, I'd never seen how I could perform it properly. It's a loose translation from the Italian called In San Gimignano, and Abigail's going to supply some academic footnotes.
San Gimignano is called the town of 1,000 towers for reasons obvious to anyone who has seen a picture of it.
And it's from the 17th century original Italian by Bartolomeo Grande.
Merely to dub this poet obscure might be to flatter him unduly.
Okay. I feel my heart and codpiece bulge with admiration for the noble members of the Tuscan aristocracy. They have put their mighty erections in every imaginable passage of our city to prick the sky uncircumscribed by petty protests of the prudish priest, whose size did not matter. Heroes expose the feeble fallacies.
This word fallacies is written as PH fallacies to capture an archaic spelling in the original.
Heroes expose the feeble fallacies of modesty and mock them as a ringmaster baits a caged and humbled beast. When such men bring out their entourage upon the public streets, tossing offers.
Tossing offers possibly indicates a custom whereby noblemen seeking retainers would throw letters of invitation to promising young men.
Tossing offers to the crowds, they hold themselves as stiffly as befits their rank and standing, riding to the rhythm of the heavy throb of drums made with 4 skins, while minstrels sing the praises of their one king.
Drums made with 4 skins. Presumably that refers to a lost technique in musical instrument manufacture. The Juan King, or Il Palado Sovrano, seems to have been a legendary hero to whom some Tuscan nobles chose to profess allegiance. This may have been a convenient ruse for avoiding the political risks of total loyalty to a living leader who was always liable to be displaced.
Unfortunately, little is known of the deeds and virtues of this mythical pale ruler, but he is said to have relied heavily for his authority upon a shadowy companion, Batoni, who possessed una bacchetta meravigliosa, a rod of extraordinary significance and power.
One can see clear parallels with the figure of Merlin in Arthurian legend.
Or indeed, as some scholars observe, with Aaron in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
It's hard, isn't it, to put that name Batoni into English so as to sound suitably impressive?
Yes, but the blunt translation knob is surely better than the more colloquial nobby, since it can be taken to mean the centre or boss of a shield and hence signify the role of protector.
There is, however, a rather more fanciful suggestion of a link with the folktale of Cinderella.
I'm afraid I've decided to interrupt proceedings at that point, and I think we'd better leave them to carry on their discussion without being observed. There will, as they say, now be a short intermission during which our audience can take a comfort break and maybe get themselves a cup of tea or even something stronger. We shall be back in 15 minutes to join the second part of the Wheeled Barn reading. Now, you can unmute and show your appreciation in the usual way.
See you later. Oh. Okay, let's see.
Welcome back to the second part of our dramatization of scenes from Poet in the Case. We are about to rejoin the reading at Wheeled Barn, and Julia is ready to introduce proceedings.
Hello again, and welcome back. It's now time for the headline performances at tonight's Wheeled Barn poetry event. As I mentioned earlier, our first guest is local poet Seth Butler, and George Hamlin will be introducing him in a few minutes. But before that happens, I'd like to say a bit more about our very special final item, Stephanie Prince's reading of newly discovered poems by the late Eric Jessup. What I didn't say before was that Eric's tragically early death 4 years ago was the result of a fall from a cliff. And it's rather poignant that George Hamlin is also here tonight because, and most of you probably know this already, he and Eric were living together as lovers at the time of Eric's death. And to tell the truth, that also makes things a bit awkward because George didn't have anything to do with the discovery of Eric's lost poems. And in fact, he still hasn't seen any of them. That's why you might have noticed George and Stephanie being a bit short with each other before the break. I'll be really sorry, actually, if there's going to be any bad feeling hanging over poor Eric's book. He and I were friends at university. Only friends, of course, because, I mean, I knew he was gay, but we quite often have a coffee together or go to the jazz club. He was really good company, and he didn't show off even when he started winning poetry prizes. I was looking at one of Eric's earlier collections the other day and realizing again just how good he was. Even when he was being playfully poetic and doing proper rhyming, he could still say real and serious things. This is one I've always liked, called Emotional Trajectories. Planets curve in orbits under forces of attraction. Lovers trace two courses, both eccentric, round one proposition, we're in love, and may reach opposition. If a full diameter divides them, empty darkness stretched between them hides them. At my perigee, when I'm most close to focusing on you, you're not supposed to be so distant. Apogees a chance for looking back on what should be a dance and not a race. Don't Newton's laws ordain that if one waits, the other one must gain? So time itself, in time, can synchronize our passions with each sunset and sunrise. Oh dear, I think I might have said a bit too much. And they're waiting to start the evening. I better let them get on with it.
Welcome back to our second half. In a moment, we'll be hearing from Seth Butler, but first, George and I are going to set the ball rolling with one more poem each. Here's one that conjures up the hopelessness of trying to hide from a fate that's bound to catch up with you. I think George may have an inkling of what I'm getting at here. Unsafe house. I wake up feeling bruised by dreams. Last night was full of clattering, a pebble dash of hail on windows, sashes rattle still, my rituals with match and gas disturb a battered kettle, whose mumble whispering resembles soft wind thickened by fine rain. Coffee keeps its promise better than most manifestos. After me, the sewer rats will get their caffeine rush. The kitchen's contents disappoint. My nose recoils from chlorine scents of pears gone past their prime. Tepid fruit drink cartons boast they're not from concentrate, then split and spill juice on my hand. I ought to blame the absent landlord rather than the former tenants for the choice of pictures. Each portrait is an alias, and landscapes are all alibis no one should believe.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. Strange that we should both have sewer rats on our minds this evening. Anyhow, my poem's about houses too, but much more charming ones. 3 stately homes, in fact, which happen to lie in a near straight line as you head south out of London. And now I come to think of it, that's not a bad metaphor for escaping the largely mundane anxieties Stephanie was hinting at. National Trust. I cut along the Cromwell Road towards Ham House. A mistress of intrigue lived here in Cromwell's time, and all the staff have fallen half in love with Lady Dysart, Restoration Matahari. The Kingston bypass keeps its promise, points me on to Selborne and beyond, to mix with other older English icons. Gilbert White, meticulous in documenting downland flowers. Never Edelweiss or Pissenlit. And Turner, making permanent a moment's movement, fixing it in Petworth lights, diffused as if by wind-snatched ashes, scattering across the sun. By the time I get to Uppark, I'll be feeling like the aging peer who married his best dairymaid, attracted, as King David was to Abishag, by a pair of firm, warm, trusted hands. And now I take on the role of host again, which requires me to say that it's a pleasure to introduce the unashamedly political poet Seth Butler. He's no stranger to controversy, nor would he wish to be. He's nothing if not controversial. He tells me that as a Kentish man, he feels a deep connection to Wat Tyler, leader of the Peasants' Revolt, and hopes that he can be just as effective and passionate in his representation of the common man. Seth Butler, do your worst.
Good evening, one and all. I'm very glad to be here, and I hope to liven things up a bit, because the people on the writing retreat have had 3 days of Stephanie's girls' school dormitory ghost stories to put up with, not to mention old George's middle-class nostalgia poems. Mind you, there is a market for George's stuff. The Tunbridge Wells Conservative Club was recently offering a copy of his latest collection as first prize in a raffle. Second prize was 2 copies. Anyway, let's get on with some serious poetry about real issues. This little haiku sums up how the ruling classes have never placed any value on workers. Wat Tyler knew all about that. The poem's called The Boot Boy and His Mistress. If I don't clean them, she's cross. If I do, she thinks they've not got dirty. Now, I understand we have a Canadian woman in our midst. I don't know if you're from anywhere near Calgary, my dear, but that's the place where they have the big stampede and celebrate the cowboy life. This next poem draws on that, but of course it really tells us how the rich take care of number one and gang up to screw the rest of us. Branding. Deploying rules and retributions to eliminate, along with criminals, the unproductive and inept, is like a stockman using whips and goads and fences to corral whatever cattle he may find unsatisfactory. Though not himself a quadruped, he's able to identify the lame, the lean, and the diseased, for herding into one small shrinking pen to leave the wider prairie free, for pasturing the prime grade beef on its polished hooves. And secretly we all know, do we not, which side of those rough posts and rails we could be standing. And here's another one about that old well-worn theme of love of money, which is the root of all evil, the good book tells us. A financier resists the statutory minimum wage. It's all about maintaining differentials, don't you see? To earn my salary and bonus shares, I have to get up early, come to London from deep in rural Surrey, or my weekend pied-à-terre in Normandy, and stare at screens of unforgiving figures, keep my ear close to gossip's groundswell, always fearful lest the tiniest slip of mouth or mouse click gives anything away. Why live like that, except for due reward? If I could make the same amount by staying close to home, to empty litter bins or clear out drains or wash the elderly, I'd do it like a shot. But then who'd bother taking time to care about the markets? And I'm going to finish off with something a bit different. It's a kind of a prose poem, I suppose, because there's nothing poetic about the ingredients. Sewage and money, spot the difference. Both have long been unavoidably involved in any human enterprise, but until recently, it wasn't done to mention either in mixed company. We all need early years tuition in what to do and not to do with both. It's when we part with some, we're most aware how much we have of either. Vast amounts of both proceed through channels out of sight and unremarked upon until the flow of either is disrupted. So experts in the large-scale oversight of both should be rewarded for their heroic efforts in unblocking either overdrafts or overflows. Surely both prestige and lavish pay are equally appropriate for anyone who either builds portfolios or puts up portaloos. That's why so many graduates in both the arts and sciences seek lucrative careers in handling either wealth or filth.
Well, I suppose we should thank you for that performance, Seth, though since you seem so pleased with yourself, our approval might be a bit superfluous. I hope you'll be offended by this and correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but aren't you really a bit of a champagne socialist, playing with radical words while making a nice, comfy living as a journalist? I'd say you were more journalist than poet, Seth. What was the subtitle of your latest book? Few and Neglected, wasn't it? Stephanie, do you think we could persuade him to give up writing by offering a prize for the best last collection?
Now, George, I think your interval drinks are getting the better of you. I'd like to step in here and thank Seth for his lively reading. And as a way of showing gratitude, I'm going to give a world premiere of some of the poems from the forthcoming Epidermis Press collection of lost Eric Jessup poems. I know you've all heard rumours about it, and to be honest, I think I've been clutching it a bit too tightly. So now it's become quite hard to share with anyone else. I might as well start by owning up that the lost manuscript was in my office all the time. The package slipped out of a batch of post and fell down behind a filing cabinet before I'd even opened it. It only turned up during a spring clean a few months ago. Once I realised what it was, it felt like an unsolicited submission from beyond the grave. And that thought can still shock me even now. I can hardly decide which one to read first. Perhaps this one. Rereading 1984. I wept when he maintained he'd not betrayed her. I was just 14 and could have claimed the same whilst sharing Winston's strange affection for O'Brien, who understood how little is admitted in owning to rebellion below the waist. She'd kept her feelings for him close and tight enough to emphasize her shapely hips. If only she and he had trusted no one else, they'd not have met again with straggling hair and no apologies to stare into each other's failure. I wept when he said baldly he'd betrayed her. And when she said she'd sold him out as well, I of course forgave her. I was just 14. In my revised edition, she was innocent. Her confession all pretense to save his face. Sitting at this dismal cafe table now, it comes to me how strongly you resemble her, but I can only guess how fiercely you resent the state we've reached, both cheated by the same O'Brien, who after all and all the time has been in charge and called the shots that echo and will echo down a hall with numbered doors we have to pass. I am not 14, and now's the time to tell you, there is no O'Brien and no cage of rodents. You weep because you know there's only me.
That's a confession by someone who knows they've hurt another person deeply.
Well, I don't know about any confessions, but I'm always in favour of a poem that pays respect to George Orwell.
Surely, it's not the particular personalities that matter. It's the universal way in which the poem manages to convey an awful sense of paranoia that's rooted in childhood trauma.
Oh, come on. Aren't we missing the point here? Okay, if nobody else is going to say it, I will. Eric didn't write that. I ought to know his work better than anyone.
Well, George, I was his publisher, wasn't I? So I should be able to recognise Eric's style when I see it.
Yes, you're his publisher, and you've spun us this tale about how you claim you found these poems, but I just know they didn't come from Eric. You've waited a few years, and now you're trying to peddle some fakes in the hope that we have forgotten the real thing.
George, how dare you say that? You've no right to accuse me.
Every right. I was living with Eric, remember? And I saw him struggling with such terrible writer's block that he barely wrote a thing in the last few months. You didn't know that, did you, Stephanie? And that's where your plan comes unstuck.
George, calm down. I'm telling you, Eric did write these poems. If he didn't show them to you when he was writing them, well, then I can understand your being upset now. But that's nothing to do with me. Although I will admit that maybe I should have shared them with you privately before reading them here tonight.
You wouldn't have dared to show them to me privately. You would have known that I'd go through them one by one, exposing them as the fakes that they are.
They aren't fakes, George, not even if you want them to be. I can show you the envelope the poems came in. I can show you the covering letter in Eric's handwriting. Julia, you were friends with Eric and you've probably seen his writing. You can drag in any expert you like. This is his handwriting.
Oh dear, I wish you wouldn't drag me into this. I don't think Eric would have wanted people to squabble over his memory like this. Whatever it means to say, Eric wouldn't have wanted. He can't want anything now or ever again.
Handwriting is neither here nor there, Stephanie, as you know perfectly well. You've got lots of correspondence from Eric in your files. It won't have taken much trouble to cobble together a forgery.
Hang on now, ladies and gents. Aren't some of us jumping the gun a bit here? I mean, we've only heard one poem. Isn't it a bit soon to be passing judgment?
Fair comment, old son, fair comment. I reckon old George is only a bit miffed because he thinks Orwell's too left-wing and shouldn't be mentioned in polite society.
Of course, the thing is, if we only had time, we could put the manuscript on the computer and compare it with Jessop's earlier work, and statistical analysis would tell us if the same person had written all of them. Now, I've got some software tools, in fact, on my laptop now, the one that George was staring at.
Look, let's stop this, shall we? Barry's right. We've only heard one poem, and maybe I didn't choose the best one to start with, but I still want to emphasize that all these poems are genuine. And I do have ways of backing up that claim. Why don't I carry on reading?
Not while I'm here, you don't. I'm not going to stay and be party to this con that you're trying to pull on people. You've made a bad mistake, Stephanie, and you are not going to get away with it.
Well, someone's reputation isn't going to survive the evening. Either Stephanie is about to be exposed as a fraud, or George has made an almighty fool of himself.
Oh, there was quite a bit of artistic temperament on show there, wasn't there? I don't think it's giving too much away to say that George Hamlin's abrupt exit is the last time the other participants, or indeed the readers of the book, will see him alive. I'm afraid he won't be the only member of the party who fails to survive the night, but you need to get hold of a copy of Poems in the Case to find out more. And I'm pleased to say that there are copies in the SPS bookshop. Now, please could you unmute and start the video by showing your appreciation in the usual way, and you're all invited to the bar afterwards if you would like to join us for a little drink.
Oh, you've left us hanging. We're hanging.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all in the bookshop.
Right. Or a deliberate ploy. Have to buy the book.
Yeah.
Colonel Mustard in the library.
Yes. Oh, dear. So if we stop our video, can you see that? No. No.
Have a drink.
Yeah.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
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 Well done, everyone.
Well done, everybody. And
May you live
thank
on.
you, Michael.
Thank you, audience.
Yes.
Thank you, the audience. Yes, thank you.
And thank you, Mike, for writing it.
Yes.
Fun to see it coming to life. Terrifying.
He's easily bullied, I can say that.
And it did really come to life tonight. Well done, everyone, with the audience. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I only made him rewrite it 4 times, so that's not bad.
And then the director added a few lines and took away some others.
Those 15 rehearsals paid off.
It seemed like 40.
Enjoyed it. I have to go now. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Nice to
Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Bye.
Sleep well.